Okay, well, welcome to Paramook 2023. The official name of the course is Parapsychology, Research, and Education, and this year's topic is apparitions, hauntings, and poltergeists. My apologies, Lisette, I got the wrong splash again. So first, I'm going to say thank you to Lisette Coley, the president of Parapsychology Foundation, and Anastasia Damalis, the executive director, for their longtime support of this course, which was started in 2015 with my late husband, Corliss Alvarado, and myself. And we couldn't do it without the PF, whether it's moral, hopeful, financial, whatever. We need that support. Then the second thing I would like to do is thank very much our organization team, Brian Williams from Psychical Research Foundation and Natasha Chisdis from Chisfilm. We've had a lot of stuff happening in the background. We're up to 292 registrants now, thanks to some of our folks beating the bushes with their network, and that's really lovely. I am going to be sending out another newsletter on Monday or Tuesday, and after we finish the presentation today, I'll have some updates on what's coming next. So I would like to tell you a bit about our speaker today, Rosemarie Pilkington. She's from Staten Island. Her talk today is Gilbert Roller and the Bindelof case, and today is March 25th. Rosemarie has been interested in psychic phenomena since childhood, when she heard family stories of unexplained visions and strange happenings. As a young adult, she immersed herself in articles, books, and journals on the subject, and attended seminars and lectures sponsored by the American Society for Psychical Research in New York. She has a BA in music and MSed, and under the mentorship of world-renowned psychologist and parapsychologist Stanley Krippner, she earned her Ph.D. in psychology in the Consciousness Studies program at Saybrook Graduate Institute, which is now Saybrook University. Doing her dissertation on children's ESP, she presented the results of her experiment to the Parapsychological Association, of which she is an associate member. She has imparted what she has learned and experienced to others by teaching classes in parapsychology and alternative healing methods, by lecturing, and especially by writing. She was a consulting editor for the newsletter Mind and Medicine, and has written book reviews and articles for publications as varied as Fate Magazine, the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research, and the Journal of Scientific Exploration. She is also the author of such books as Men and Women of Parapsychology, Personal Reflections, and of course, The Spirit of Dr. Bindelof, the Enigma of Séance Phenomena.
Here. Okay, so one of my favorite topics, Gilbert Roller, who was a friend of mine, and the Bindelof case, which has become well known, thank goodness, I hope partially from the book. And it's a story about teenage 20th century mediumship. And my new website is down at the bottom here, seancescience.com. There's a lot more about the book and about me and about all sorts of physical phenomena in it. And it's the kind of thing you can come back to again and again. And I hope you'll take a look at it. Okay, so who was Gilbert Roller? Well, I met Gilbert Roller. I was going out with a fellow who turned out to be quite psychic. I had the knowledge, he had the ability. And I got him to take 2 courses with me at the New School. One of the courses was entitled Paramechanics, which actually was another name for psychokinesis, PK. And it was taught by this tall, lanky fellow named Gil Roller. And he had a great deal to say. He just did a usual thing about PK. But towards the end of it, he started to talk about experiments that he had done. And one of the experiments that he had done had to do with a transistor radio. He would put transistor radio in the center of a table where they were doing a kind of seance thing. And they would do a countdown, 5, 4, 3, 2. When they got to about 3 or 2, they would stop counting. And on the count on 0, they would try to send some kind of force or energy to that little transistor radio. And once in a while, they would get a popping sound, like a popcorn sound from the radio. Nobody knows what causes it, but that's what was happening. So he tried it with the class, and he divided us into 2 groups. And one of the groups wasn't getting any effect. The other group, in which my later to be my husband, my boyfriend was in, always got the pop. And this fellow, Nick, his name was, decided he could do this on his own. So he put his hand over the radio and he'd get it to pop. And then he got it to control it more and more. And the whole story is in the Bindelof book. But anyway, we continued the experiments after the class at Gil's apartment, other apartments too, but I got to know Gilbert quite well then, and his wife, Marion. By the way, I'm wearing her earrings and necklace today as a kind of tribute to her. And through this radio experiment, I also got to meet Dr. Ullman. I knew of Dr. Ullman. I had done extensive reading, et cetera, and I used to go to lectures. But there I got to meet him. And during the course of our social interactions, they started to talk a little bit about the experiences they had had as teenagers. And that experience so changed Dr. Ullman's life that that's why he went into parapsychology, because of these experiences. And I was kind of fascinated by the little bit that they told me. My friendship, excuse me, I am having trouble with my throat today. My friendship with the Rollers continued for a long time, even after the marriage broke up. And I got to meet, besides Dr. Ullman, other members, and one was Larry Levin. By then, Larry Levin was calling himself Gilbert Lawrence. The reason had to do with something with papers, with these, he was from a poor family, and it had to do with something with the welfare department. But anyway, he adopted the name Gilbert Lawrence, and that was the name he used. But to me, he was always Larry, and to the other people too. And he was quite an outgoing fellow. And he and Larry, he and Gil wanted very much for the story of their experiences to be told. Dr. Ullman he had talked about them. In fact, he even mentioned Gil Roller in my first Men and Women of Parapsychology, but that was the first time he even mentioned it in print. He did not want to have it in print because he was afraid of the kind of ostracism that other people like Jewel Eisenbud, et cetera, had experienced. So he never said anything publicly about it. And he went along with the idea for the book in that he gave me materials and things. This is the cover of the book, Dr. Bindelof's picture, which is the photograph on the cover. I better start at the beginning. The beginning is really this lady. Her name was Olga Roller. She was, as you can see here, this is on the Schubert, in the Schubert Theater in New York in, I think, around 1917. She was a lovely woman, a good actress, and a fine singer, beautiful voice. There's only one record of her that is at the Lincoln Central Library, and I have a copy of it. Gorgeous voice. And she sang on Broadway and was on the road a lot. She was very interested in parapsychology. She had an extensive library of all the famous scientific books of the day, Lombroso and these other people. And she used to have seances. She was a friend of the Dolly sisters. They would sit backstage and have seances. And she introduced Gil actually to his first seance. I'll tell you about that in a second. This is Gil's stepfather. Gil never knew his natural father. His natural father was an Argentinian naval officer, very high family, named Federico Guerrico. And after he was born, the parents, I don't know if they ever truly were married or not. Gil said they were married and divorced, but who knows? He went back to Argentina and she stayed, continued her career. And she was a friend of Eddie. Eddie was a pianist. He played the piano in Luchau's, which was the hub of entertainment in the early part of the 20th century. And they were both temperamental artists, whatever, so they had a very tempestuous kind of relationship. And Gil was very much affected by that. He was very close to his mother. And she would get angry with Eddie and she would take out dishes from the closet and throw them and break them, and Eddie would clean it up. And there were all sorts of conflicts in the house, which the young boy was very sensitive to. And before you knew it, strange things started to happen in their apartment. They had what we call a PK or RSPK or poltergeist outbreak. She had kind of Gibson hairdo with hairpins, and those hairpins would go flinging across the room sometimes from an empty room. They bang against the door, whatever. And they named it Liz. They would say, Liz, throw something, and zing, something would get thrown. One day, Gil, he was sitting in the living room and he heard this commotion in a cabinet. He thought one of their cats had gotten in the cabinet and was panicking or something. And so it was making a lot of noise, and he opened the cabinet, and in there was a metal Lionel toy train, completely wrecked, torn apart, wires hanging out of it. I mean, it was his favorite toy and it was completely wrecked. Nobody had touched it, and it had made this commotion in the cabinet. And when they found it was wrecked. Sometimes they would go out and they'd come back and find crayoned on the walls in big, like 4-foot-high letters, "Go, go" written. At any rate, Eddie kind of suspected Gil had something to do with all of this, but he called in Hereward Carrington, who was in New York at that time. And Carrington did a cursory examination, talked to Gil a little bit, had to empty his pockets, found a couple of hairpins and rubber bands in his pocket. All this, the kid must be responsible for it. Didn't explain the toy train getting ripped apart, how a boy could do that, or the crayon walls or anything else like that, and other things that were happening. But later on, he did write in some of his, I put it in the book, that these outbreaks, RSPK outbreaks, were very often associated with a young person, especially in a troubled situation like this. So Gil had this experience. This is a cartoon that I found amongst his things after his death, after both their deaths. A kind of a satiric comic rendition of a home seance. You can see the cats under the table and the medium or something listening with long tubes, whatever. It's kind of a parody of some seances he had later on in his life. Because Gil was the child of a star, she was on the road lots of times. He didn't go to school. He was tutored. And he used to have to disappear, and then she took him off to Europe one year. And so they had moved into a new neighborhood, uptown New York, Manhattan, on the West Side. And he really didn't know anybody. He was very introverted as it was. Played the piano, he did photography, he was an artist, he did all sorts of things, but he really didn't have any friends. And he met this fellow, Leonard Lauer, who was a very bright precocious teenage, young, 14, 15 years old, who went to Townsend Harris High School, which was a high school for very bright boys. And he was kind of very impressed with himself and with his education. He was telling Gil something about Mencken and other things that he had read. And Gil said to him in retaliation, well, that's just surface knowledge, you know, you don't really know the important things. And he introduced him to some of the books that he had in his and his mother's library: Hudson, Myers, Richet, Lombroso, Schrenk, the whole gamut. Well, Leonard, who was intellectual, was really convinced by what he was reading, very impressed with the caliber of the science. So they decided he wanted to experiment, so they decided they were going to try it. They were afraid to do anything in Gil's apartment because of the commotion that his poltergeist activity had caused a few years before. So when Lenny's parents went out, they got a bridge table, they took away the rug, and they start sitting, trying to imitate what they had read about. And eventually they got movements, tilting, levitation, a little bit of levitation. They were bursting with excitement, but they didn't know who to talk to. And Lenny knew Larry because Larry went to the same school that he did. And Larry joined them. And after the first or second time, they got levitation so high that the table went up almost to the ceiling. And they were taller than Larry, and Larry was always a little bit shorter. And then he pulled on the leg, and then it fell down and broke the spell. It also broke the table. And they had to explain it. They started to become more organized. They added other boys, or at least Lenny added other boys, because Gil didn't know anybody. So these were boys that were coming from Townsend Harris High School, all very bright, way ahead of their time, because they would start at 14 or whatever. They'd be out of high school at 16 going to college. Mark Yellman, that happened to him. There was only one, a cousin of one of the members, George Kaiser's cousin Leo, who was kind of dull. He was kind of their mascot. But otherwise, they were all very bright, precocious boys. And they started meeting regularly every Saturday night. I'm sorry, this throat. And as they met regularly, they got more consistent phenomena. They also were keeping records. They kept minutes all the time. They were very organized. And they were getting raps, sounds, knocks, etc., and some spelling out messages. Since Gil was interested in photography, they had, in those days, they used emulsion covered glass plates, not the film that we had later on. And they decided they would try some experiments. So they knew enough. They went to the camera store together. They bought the plates. They made a dark room in the bathroom. They went in 2 or 3 or 4 at a time to open the box so there'd be no chicanery. Nobody could fool around with it. They were very precise. And then what are we going to do with it? Well, they put the glass plate in its metal container, light-proof container. And the first thing they did, they said, well, we'll put my hand on it and see what happens. So somebody put their hand on it. The others all held hands around the table. And they waited, nothing happened. And then they went back to ask the table, and they got raps, and it rapped out, they would do the alphabet, ABC, and it would rap, and they'd stop. It rapped out the word plate. So they said, oh, that must mean to develop it. So they went to develop it. And what came out on the picture was the hand that was on the hand shape, but it was not a negative, but a positive, as though there was some radiation that had come down on the hand. They did that a couple of times, and they did other things through keys, and the keys came out. And then they thought, well, let's do a thought photo. Let's see if we can just think of something and have it on the plate. And so they thought of a milk bottle. They said, well, everybody knows what a milk bottle is. So they concentrated on the milk bottle. When they developed the plate, this is what they got on the left. It was a bottle, but it's an iodine bottle. And this is even more distinct, indistinct than what they got, but they could, in the original, read the label, and it said Rio Pharmacy, which was the nearby pharmacy. And they all had a bottle of iodine in their closets. And then they tried it by trying to think of a person. And Larry had been just dating a young girl named Olympia, I think. So they said, well, we don't know her, so you think of her, we'll see if we can get her picture. So Larry, I think, put the plate up against his forehead or something, and they concentrated, and then they developed it. And what came out was this image. And Gil looked at it, he said, you know, that looks like it was an amulet that I think his aunt, who was his contemporary. In fact, I have a picture here. I don't know if you can see this. That's his Aunt Ellie. She was like 2 months younger than he was. They were brought up together. She had brought it back from the West, and much later they found it somewhere in the house. But that's what it seemed like. So it seemed, even at this point, that there's always a connection with Gil in these things, that Gil seems to be the one who is transmitting the information, if that's the term you could use. They then asked for if they could get written message, because they were getting very fed up with the slow alphabet kind of thing. And they asked, you know, they had yes or no answers, and they got a yes answer. So they said, okay, well, let's try. So they, at this time, they weren't using a bridge table. They were using a small night table that had an open shelf. So they put a couple of sheets of foolscap paper on the lower shelf with a pencil. And they put out the lights, put their hands around the table, each holding onto the other's, feet holding each other's feet, in this very small, cramped room. And they started to get messages. They would hear the pencil scratching and then being slapped down. And when it wrote, it would write so fast. They said you couldn't write that fast. They could hear it going. Sometimes the messages would be just short. Sometimes they'd be much longer. Sometimes, in this case, the paper would be crumpled up. They would hear it crunch up, and when they put on the light, and they'd have to go unfold it to read it. And this one says, "Thought I told you to go to the dentist." That was a message for Larry, because Larry had very, very bad teeth, and he was always being admonished to do that. In this case, there were a couple of pieces of paper. You can see this is the edge of one, edge of another. The message said, "Don't use pills too thick frequently." The LY was probably written on the table. So it was written right across the two pieces of paper. They started to recognize that when this entity would communicate with them before, it would announce itself by what they started to call a staccato signature. What it sounded like, from what they've all told me, because I interviewed all these people, was a drum roll. It sounded very, very fast. And they said they tried it, even Gil, who was a pianist, trying it to do it manually. You couldn't do it. But it would end with a bang, which they couldn't do even when they tried, but you would see them, because when they were working in these rooms, in this room, Gil's small bedroom, first of all, it was in New York. In New York, if any of you know the city, it's always lit up. So even if you have drawn blinds, etc., you always have some light in the room. So they could always see that it was a very small room, and they could see each other's outlines and sometimes their features, etc. You would be able to tell if anybody was doing this manually. But this would seem to announce this particular entity. And at one point, in a long message, you can see this long message here, he introduces himself as Dr. Bindelof. And he told them that his very highfalutin language, his purpose was to continue healing. He was a doctor in real life, and asked them would they be the disciples of a dead man. Very, very grandiose. Well, of course, they were all intrigued with this. And so they continued all these things. At one point, I guess he gave them instructions of how to construct a device so that they could speak to him. And he even gave them a diagram of how to do it. Eventually, then they asked, well, can we have a picture of you? And he replied in the writing, yes, and gave them instructions. Full aperture and total darkness, focus the camera at the center of the table, open the lens for 20 or 30 seconds, and then develop. Now, were these instructions needed? Well, at that point, I guess they thought they were. Of course, I think we understand now that they weren't. It was just part of their imaginations or someone's Gilbert's imagination. At any rate, when they developed the plate, this is what resulted. This 3/4 image of somebody who looks like, I guess, a Dr. Bindelof, wing collar or whatever. If you notice the fuzziness, if you know what the Ted Serios pictures look like, there is the same kind of striation and fuzziness in them. It's not a very clear picture. It doesn't look like a photograph, yet it doesn't look like a painting or anything like that, but it has the same properties. Well, of course, they were all amazed. Even as old men, they were still amazed when they would look at it that this thing came out. Larry, who for the rest of his long life always believed that Dr. Bindelof was his guardian angel, whatever, carried this picture around with him in his wallet until he was almost 100 when he died, and he still kept it. I was at the Roller's house one time, and there was a young man, guest of theirs, that came in, and Gil showed him one of the original prints that they had made from this. And he said, you know, Gil, this looks a little like you. Well, in a sense, it did with the high cheekbones. You'll see Gil's picture. But it reminded me of the mediums who produced phantoms who looked like themselves. Most famous, of course, would be Katie King. People accused her of dressing up in white robes and being the medium of dressing in white robes and being her. Kluski, when he was first producing phantoms, they almost looked like doppelgangers. They looked like copies of himself. And when somebody finally brought it to his attention, then they changed. So I was wondering if there was anything, I don't know, you know, if that would be it, but of course, Gil was much younger when this came out. This, as you can see, looks much more like the original pictures, because most of what I had were copies, but I do have some of the originals. The yellow fool's cap with the printing. Bindelof printed, block printing. Notice this one is not block printing. It's in response to some comment that Larry made. You're not so wrong, Larry. This was done by another entity who called himself Dr. Rinchner and was supposedly a friend of Dr. Bindelof, and he would come once in a while. He would announce himself with 5 raps, 5 knocks. So they would have, and then there was a third entity who called himself Bad. And Bad, this is Dr. Rinchner here. I am a friend of the dealer, of the doctors. And then some weak, which probably referred to something they had said. Bad was kind of a very primitive entity, kind of Tarzan me Jane talk. And here he writes, both gone, me here, now please, bad. So it's a combination of printing and script writing. Very strange. He was always trying to get in the act and they would never let him. This is interesting. Monty had to leave the group. In fact, his parents were very much against him being in the group because they thought it was detracting from his studies, and they wanted him to go to medical school, be a doctor, etc. At one seance, it was an interesting thing. He was torn, and he asked Dr. Bindelof if he could. He wanted to ask him a question, but he did it mentally. He didn't want to do it out loud so the other boys would hear. And the answer that came back was something Overstreet, something with Overstreet. Well, nobody knew what that meant except for Monty, because Monty had consulted a professor, Overstreet, about this, and he took it as, saying go and talk to him about it or something. At any rate, at one point, then Monty had to leave for medical school or for college, and he was replaced by Marianne Meeder. Now, Marianne Meeder was a friend. Her father was George Meeder. He was I think a Wagnerian singer from German. In fact, he showed up in a movie on the town, I think, with Frank Sinatra, etc. He's the curator of a museum who's after them because they they knocked down bones of a dinosaur or something. But anyway, that was George Meeder. And I think they lived in the Ansonia building, which is a building of artists and singers, etc. So they had, later on, they switched their meetings there. But anyway, she replaced Monty in the group as a secretary and minute taker. And one night the group was almost breaking up at that point. They asked the doctor about developing talking. Could they get a message? And he said to give them, to get a megaphone. So they made a megaphone out of a cardboard or whatever. And they put out the lights. The megaphone was levitated and there were some indistinct sounds. And they got a larger megaphone and they heard whispered names and phrases. Larry said to me that he heard, it was nothing important. It was like, hello, Larry, how are you? Something, but he said it wasn't talking, it was whispering, but he could hear it clearly. And it went around and everybody was hearing it. Later on in the evening, after they had stopped, Gil's aunt, Ellie, the one I showed you a picture of, came in. She had been out. And they said, let's have another sitting so that Ellie can hear too. And when I interviewed her, she said, yeah, she heard, it was just, kind of nothing important or anything, but said hellos and things like that. Again, and she said very whispery, wasn't loud sounds. Now, I wrote this up in the book. If you look at Dr. Ullman's account of this, you will not find it. He didn't want me to put it in the book, as a matter of fact. And I said, why not? He said, well, I wasn't there. And I said, yes, but you told me if there was any discrepancy in anything to look at the minutes, because the minutes were always kept faithfully and faithfully checked at the next meeting. He said, yes, but I didn't take the minutes. So I thought this was very interesting because it's very hard for us to accept all these phenomena. They exceed our boggle threshold. But even Monty, who was convinced of all the other phenomena, was still not sure about this. He would not sign on to this because he wasn't there. He didn't hear it. So it's an interesting psychological thing, I think. At any rate, I can't even read the top of my thing. There's something up here. Okay, anyway, but the group was weakened because they were changing venue. Other people were coming in, and it was, people were losing interest, I think. And they started getting some strange things. They got some mirror writing, upside down and backwards. This, I think, says watch or something. I don't remember what it says. I'd have to get my mirror out to look. This one, I think, is interesting, especially with what we've learned about processes in the mind and how you change things, how the unconscious mind is very literal. They were getting discouraged, and the message they got was, I think this one, the first one: there is no sense sitting. Well, they got upset. Larry got upset especially, and he said, well, could you clarify that? And so what happened was they went back again and they got the same message, but this time written much more clearly: there is no sense sitting. And they started laughing. They said, no, we meant, can you elaborate? Of course, you know what happened. It became very elaborate. So it was repeated again, but very elaborately: there is no sense sitting. And I guess that's what they were feeling. They sort of gave up, and it ended. What happened? I went back. What happened? Oh, I see. I went the wrong way. Sorry. Okay. I also talk in the book about other aspects, the kinds of things that they read about that they were trying to imitate. And of course, Palladino is the epitome of levitating things at that point, and Hume, etc. Now, they read about ectoplasm. This is Stanislava P. with the ectoplasm oozing through the net that's encasing her head. But did they have ectoplasm? Was there ectoplasm? Well, there was touches, and they could see things. For instance, they had radium watches. In those days, they would have radium dials that you could see at night. Nobody realized how dangerous that was. And they would see shadows passing over the watches in the dark. They would feel touches. One time, Gil actually got slapped. They were sitting, they had their hands all tight, they could see each other really in the dark. And the message said that Dr. Bindelof was going to go and touch them each in turn. And he got kind of panicky. He said, I'm going to grab him when he comes around, or something like that. And suddenly they heard this smack, and Lenny, who was sitting across from Gil, could see his face grimace and his head fly back. And they turned on the light, and Gil had this red mark on his face. Now, they could see if somebody slapped him, but that didn't happen. But his head did go back, and he was stunned, whatever. Ellie, when she came home one night, she had been to the dentist and had a toothache after the dentist. And so Gil's mother and Gil, they just had an impromptu meeting and said, see if Dr. Bindelof can help you. And she said she felt what felt like a finger, but not a human finger, touch her cheek, penetrate the cheek, press on the tooth, and the pain went away. So I said to her, Ellie, if it didn't feel like, you wrote it didn't feel like a human finger, what did it feel like? She said, like a hot dog filled with air. So I don't know. Howard, one of the other men, was sitting in this small room. They were all crowded. And he was sitting with his chair back against the wall. So nobody could have gone behind him. But when he asked to have Dr. Bindelof cure his headache or something, he said he felt hands coming from behind and kind of gently massaging his head. And then he would just tap him as he did, and then he'd go away. So they were getting something. I don't know, was this ectoplasm? Who knows if it was ectoplasm or not. Ectoplasm is a very mysterious kind of thing. This coming out of the mouth or the other orifices of the body seems to be a certain particular way that some people responded up until Helen Duncan. But in other cases, you don't see anything like that. Kluski never had anything coming out of his mouth or anything that anybody could see. These phantoms just sort of appeared, although we don't know what goes on between Kluski and when the phantom is there. I was thinking of Rudy Schneider. When they were doing experiments with Rudy Schneider, with a laser beam. Even though Schneider was sitting in his chair, the laser beam would get interrupted as though like something were going through it to reach something else that he was trying to affect. So perhaps at times this force, whatever it is invisible and then manifests itself. I don't know, this is another mystery, but it's a strange thing. Also, the pictures that we have, I don't know if I have any here. No, I guess not. The pictures that we have of, well, here I have. Yeah, I hadn't put this up, had I? I'm sorry. The pictures that we have of people exuding ectoplasm look very fake. And if you're just looking at the pictures, I wouldn't blame you for saying this is all nonsense, this is all fake. They look like cardboard cutouts. But you have to go to the documents and look at the people who were there when the pictures were being taken. And it seems that what they were seeing was not what the photographs were showing. And yet when we see something that looks more realistic, sometimes it's more frightening. I took out this old book by Alexander Imich called Incredible Tales of the Paranormal, in which he had some pictures of Kliski. I don't know, I'll hold it up, see if I can hold it up to the camera. I don't know if you can see this picture here. It's Kliski with the bird of prey that has manifested on his head. And that to me was kind of more mind-boggling because it looks too real. And it's, you know, but if these phantoms like Katie King would walk around, et cetera, and yell, yes, they must have looked real. If people could shake their hands and take their pulse and put their arms around them, as Hooks did and Crooks did, and nearly got himself into trouble. It's still a mystery. Why don't people produce ectoplasm anymore if someone masked? Maybe they do, but maybe we can't see it, or maybe it's taking different forms. It seems that if you have an idea, like my ex-husband got an idea from Gil about producing this radio experiment, this pop, and got it to do all sorts of things that Gil had not imagined it could do. Seems once the person gets that idea that they can do that, Ted Serio's got the impression through hypnosis that he could put his mental images on film. That seems to be the impetus. Well, today, nobody's interested in ectoplasm. They're more interested in EVP and electronic things, et cetera. So I think this takes different forms as our minds or our desires take different forms. I don't know if I'm getting my point across, but I hope I am. At any rate, let's go on. Okay. Monty, Dr. Ullman, much to his credit, kept the materials from the seances and all the other materials, and he organized reunions of the original group. And he would ask them to tell their story in their own way. And then they would meet. He would actually help them to fly and meet at his house. I think this is up at his house in Ardsley, so that they would compare notes and try to work out any discrepancies in memory. So this case is one of the best documented cases around. This is Montague Ullman here. This is Larry. This is Lenny. I never got to meet Lenny, unfortunately. I was going to interview him, and the day I was going to interview him, he had a heart attack and died. Monty called me, said, don't go. This is Howard Frisch, who was a very quiet man, had a book shop, I think, antique books, etc. He was the one who got massage on the back of the head that I told you about. And this was George Kaiser, and there's Gil. So this is, of course, in the 1960s, I believe. And this is Gil and Larry's second wife, Pat. up at the top of the Des Artistes building when they were in their late 70s. Gil was a year older than all the others. Now, people have asked me, well, who was this Dr. Bindelof? Was he really a spirit, as Larry believed? Larry believed, yes, this was his guardian angel watching over him. None of the others did. Gil first was on the fence, but Gil, I think, he was reluctant, talk about ownership resistant, to accept that he was the genesis of a lot of this. No name ever surfaced Bindelof. They searched during their time. Monty searched. I searched on the computer. Anybody wants to search, be my guest. But the name doesn't seem to exist. I think it's from Gil's unconscious. Gil's mother was Austrian. His nanny spoke German. And Bindel, of course, sounds very German. Olga, that wasn't her born name, I don't think, but no, maybe it was. Olga, of course, is a German name. And he was it's a Russian name. And Gil was very fond of Rachmaninoff. It was one of his favorite composers. So Bindelof could be something from his unconscious. But no trace was ever found of a doctor by that name or anybody by that name. They've speculated that all these boys either had no father or a father who was emotionally absent, and that perhaps he fulfilled the role of father figure. That's also possible. I don't know. These kids were young. They were intellectual, idealistic, not interested in contacting deceased loved ones. They were more interested in exploring, in scientific exploration, see how far they could take something. And as Monty said to me once, it was like a thrill. It was like being on a roller coaster. You got scared, but you went back again the next time for more. Gil also, what makes me think that he was the center of all this, was his compassion and his desire to heal. On my website, seancescience.com, there's the page that talks about the Bindelof book. You can go to Insights, and in there is a short story that Gil wrote called Rat. He wrote it as an adult, but it's autobiographical, I'm sure. And it's about a boy who's walking along the Hudson River side and sees a rat, a dying rat. And it's all about his compassion to help him, and he can't help him. The rat dies, and he's despondent because the rat dies. And that was Gil. Loved animals, especially cats, always helping. When I used to visit him, sometimes he wouldn't be home, and his wife Marion would say, oh, he goes once a week to read to a blind woman. So, I mean, he did these kinds of things. His background was also this creativity. So the staccato really was like the drum roll. His mother, after all, was both his mother and his stepfather were both in show business. So drum roll was kind of something that would be very familiar to him. And I just talked about the combination of the German-Russian name. Again, you can, if you want to believe, as Larry did, that this was a real spirit, fine. I don't. Most of the people in the group did not. And in one of the books that they devoured, Hudson's The Law of Psychic Phenomena, in chapter 15, Spiritism, he says, displays a profound understanding of the subjective mind and communication of two subjective minds. It's well known that anyone can as readily obtain a communication from an imaginary person as from a real one, providing the medium does not happen to know the facts. And I think that probably has influenced them as well. So Hudson's and my conclusion was that there were no spirits. The phenomena were generated by we call living agents, the medium's living ability. And that opinion was shared by Monty and most of those who participated, except for Larry. Is there an inherent force or ability that's responsible for telepathy and PK? That's something that everybody's working on now. I'm hoping someday, after I'm long gone, that answers will be found. It seems people in quantum physics are doing a good job of starting to trace. And of course, the implications of this force for science are profound. How can boys stand with their hands over a table and get that table to lift up to them? Are they changing the force of gravity? Think of what Hume did, D.D. Hume, where he would walk into a room and the entire room would shake. Tables, large tables laden with glass, with crystal, with everything on them, would rise up, tilt, nothing would fall off, everything would stay on the table. There's a picture in the book, I brought it also to see you. Somebody who noticed at one of this D.D. Hume seances that he affected a table, and the table would rise up, etc., and kind of do a jig. And there was a candlestick on the table, and the table rose up and tilted, and the candlestick tilted, and the candle tilted, and the flame tilted. Now, ordinarily, ordinarily, the flame would have stayed up. So what does that mean if the flame is also tilting? Has he altered the gravitational state around that complete table? I begin to think that might be a clue. If you know anything about the flying monk, Joseph of Cupertino, when he would levitate, he would go into a trance. It was like he was in a bubble. His garments would not flap in the wind, in the breeze. They would be just intact, and he would like climb onto a tree or something and stay there. So that to me would also indicate that there's some gravitational field that's changed or is whatever around them. I don't know. I'm not a physicist, but I think the implications are enormous for science. Phenomena outside the seance room. It's been noted in many cases, that when people get involved in seances and get physical results, that it kind of follows them. That happened with Larry especially. And I think Larry is very, very important in these things. While Gil might have been the so-called medium, Larry, I think, gave a lot of his energy and seemed to have some ability of his own, although he was never able to do anything like this himself. But his energy, I think, was important. I think Crawford even talked about the medium being the person who exuded the force, but drew on the energy of other people. And of course, you're dealing with teenagers here, 15, 16, 17-year-olds who are filled with libidinal energy. So Larry's, a couple of times, his watch crystal would just break for no reason at all while they were doing these things. When he and Gil were working, this was during the experiments, when they were doing the meetings, they got a job working for a hat label company. And their job was to get the orders from the different companies, Macy's, Gimbels, whatever. And they'd say 2 for Macy's, 3 for Gimbels, or whatever. And they would put the right labels in envelopes and then deliver them. And they were careful to do that, right? And suddenly they were getting complaints that wrong labels were in the envelopes, the labels were switched. So they were very extra careful to make sure that they were putting the right labels in the right envelopes, and still they would be switched. So something was going on there that was not. after the sessions, after the Bindelof Society broke up, Larry was seeing some girl out in Queens, I think. And he came home and he had a bridge. And he took out his bridge and he put it in a glass by his bed and went to sleep. In the morning, he woke up and the bridge was gone. And he thought maybe his brother was fooling around or something. They said, no, they never found it and everything. Make a long story short, they never found the fourth day. It disappeared. One of Mary Rose Barrington's jots just disappeared. Also, there were falling stones. In their teen years, one day, I don't think Larry was with them that day, but Gil and a couple of the other guys were in a cemetery downtown, and they went inside a tomb. And I think Gil was feeling guilty that they really shouldn't have been doing that. And suddenly they started being pelted with stones from inside the tomb. They ran out and even outside. Later on in his life, when he was long as an adult, he was asked to help out with a seance. They was a famous, I can't think of his name now. He was the man who made the dinosaurs for the Sinclair exhibit at one of the World Fairs. Jonas something, whatever. His son wanted to have a seance. So Gil said he would help out. And he went up and they were around a table. I guess the table started to move or something, I don't know. But he thought that people were pushing it or cheating. And he got annoyed. Gil could be temperamental. And so he walked away from the table over to a corner of the room. And as he turned around, stones started falling from the ceiling onto the table. Again, they were doing something that he felt was wrong or not right. And they were being pelted with stones. So there were two instances in his life, once when he was a teenager and once when he was an adult, where there was stones being pelted. Okay, living agents. This Paramook has been all about poltergeists and things like that. And of course, Gil was a typical one of those poltergeist kids, where he's a troubled teenager. He can't really act out any other way. Also, as Ehrenwald had pointed out, sometimes in an upset situation, a child will act out his mother's aggression. And of course, that could be very much so in this case, where he's not acting out physically, but he's acting out by causing things to fall out of the closets and things to be thrown around the room and whatever. Some of it is also directed at the self. Certainly the toy train, this is something he cherished and was destroyed. And one time they were walking outside and something fell off I think a milk bottle fell off a sill and nearly hit him, whatever. So as in some of these cases, I think in Tina Resch's case too, there was action against themselves. Gil was the only one of the whole group who was at all the sessions where phenomena occurred. If he wasn't there, nothing happened. He was also the only one who was able to obtain phenomena in his adulthood. He met upstate with a group. I think that's where that original silly drawing that he did came from. They were mostly women. And he and I think Marion sat in, yeah, she did, because she talked about it. He and his wife sat in with this group. And as they were sitting, it was a large dining room table and it had leaves, the pieces that come out, and those things started to come up and flap. And the women got upset and they stopped. The radio experiment I told you about that we did, the stones from the ceiling, other unexplained happens, and his creativity. we haven't talked much about that. There seems to be a lot of creative people who are also psychic and vice versa. I'm thinking of Chuck Honorton's experiments, for instance, with the Gansfeld, where he got people, musicians and artists to come in, musicians from Juilliard, and they did beautifully on the tests. There seems to be some connection. Well, no one was more creative in the group than Gil. In fact, Larry had said to me in his old age, he said, I've never known a man who was that creative. He's the most creative man I've ever known. Here you see Gil, some kids watching him as he's doing a painting. This painting is right off my bedroom wall. I found it in Gil's apartment. I had it framed. He didn't really do much about bringing himself forward. He promoted his wife's work, but not his own. The colors are much too bright here. I guess the flash from the phone camera or whatever, it's much more subdued. And you can see it's kind of fantastic, and it's very lonely with this. And as I said, the colors here are too bright. In the original, it's not bright at all. And there's another one that he did also of a lone boater. I got an email asking if the R. Roller that I was writing about was the same R. Roller who did illustrations for a magazine of weird stories. And I found this amongst Gil's things. It's a page from one of those magazines with an illustration that he did. And I have some other pictures from it that I can show you if you want. This picture I found amongst his things, him playing the accordion. I didn't know he played the accordion. I knew he played the guitar somewhat. He was an excellent pianist before I met him. Then he got that problem where your finger stays in or whatever, and then he had it fixed. But he really didn't play anymore when I knew him. They had a piano, then they sold it. But I also found the piano bench one time when I was there, some compositions. So he was writing musical compositions, and they were quite good. So he was just, he did all these different things. He wrote books, stories, etc. He wrote a book, A Voice from Beyond, published in 1975, which was a great deal about crooks and Katie King. In fact, I have a letter that Jewel Eisenbud wrote to him. Evidently, he sent Jewel a copy, and Jewel was very taken with it, with the book. He left behind at least one novel, a play about crooks and Katie King, and several short stories, which I have. And that rat short story I told you about before, it really illustrates his compassion. If you can, go to the books page on my Seance Science website and look for insights, and you'll find it. Was Dr. Bindelof an alter ego of Gil Roller? Possibly. I don't know. I'm not going to speculate on this anymore. You will read it and make up your own minds. So what does it leave us with? More questions than answers. There's the spirit hypothesis or powers of the living, either the living agent theory. We know there are secular mediums, what I call secular mediums. The Philip group, the group that was started by Iris Owens on the direction of her husband in Canada. They got wonderful results in complete full lighting with a made-up ghost. There was no real spirit. They made up the story of Philip, etc. Bachelor subjects, certainly there was no spirituality there. That was purely scientific investigation. There was Ted Sirios. The spirits he had were ones he drank. Nina Kulagina, of course. Felicia Parisi, who adamantly says there's nothing spiritual about what she did. She tried to imitate Kulagina, and she succeeded to an extent. What is the role of consciousness? There's a lot of talk nowadays in many areas about consciousness. If we understand consciousness, will we understand these phenomena? I don't know. How do we get from spontaneous to conscious production? There's the rub. We know people, ordinary people who never had any other experiences, sometimes have some kind of spontaneous psychokinesis. Some of you might remember Fanny Knipe, who's now in her, she's almost 100 years old. I guess she's 98 now. But she was having an argument with her husband one day in their living room they had the house up in Massachusetts. And she said she felt very frustrated and angry. She couldn't get her points across, etc. And she said she felt this heat in her solar plexus, and suddenly they heard a sound from the next room. And they walked into the room, and there in the middle of the floor was a picture that had been, the small picture that had been hanging on the wall in the middle of the floor. Now, in order for that picture to get there, it would have had to lift itself off its hook, come over the back of a chair, a height that was in front of it, and land on the floor. So there was definitely something that was psychokinetic. Did it ever happen to her again? Not really. I don't think so. I mean, she didn't report anything else, but that happens once in a while. Now, how do you get that kind of spontaneous thing to be done consciously? That's another whole thing to work on, another fruitful area. Is ectoplasm passé? What's hot now? The other things, I don't know. It seems whatever catches a person's idea. Can I do this? Do you think I could do that? And if they get the spark and feel they can do it, they'll do it. Here's Gil. This was up in, they had a house up near Claverack, and always with a cat or some animal to love. Thank you for listening, and thank you for Nan and Brian for all the help you gave me. Please go to my website. It's a new website. I keep adding to it. And you'll find lots of things to explore. Okay, how do I get out of this now?
Just stop sharing.
Stop sharing. Okay, there we go.
Yeah, there you go. Well, thank you so much, Rosemarie. That's such an interesting story, and I'm sorry that I'm shy one late husband, because he would have lots and lots and lots of questions and comments to make. And this is an area that I'm interested in but don't know very much about. I do want to say though, I found it really, I've read the book and I've heard you talk about the Bindelof group before, but I don't know why this hit me, but it hit me that they just expected everything to keep going and keep evolving, and that whatever they asked for was going to happen. And that's so cool, because there's so many, so many folks that are very serious about having a sitter group and that kind of thing, and nothing happens, or something, you get a little bit and then everybody gets nervous and doesn't want to go further.
I think because they were young teenagers, and teenagers,
yeah,
they're going to live forever. They can do whatever they want. They're not inhibited, and they had a common purpose.
Yeah.
Common purpose. And I think that's so important. And when that common purpose started to fall apart is when the group ended. They became other things, pursuing girls, politics, school, whatever. They had to go on with their lives. And so they stopped. I see.
So there was a coherent
messages. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. There's Lizette.
Well, Lizette says she's saying in the PF YouTube channel, there's one of the Perspective Classic lectures with Monty and Gil discussing the case.
I put that also on my website, so you can get it there.
Oh, excellent! And Brian, we can put that on the materials page. I finally added the materials page to the Paramook menu on the website, so you can find that. They had a coherent purpose. That's probably, like you're saying, it's that point in their lives, they had that group, that wonderful literature that was really heavy duty stuff that was, behind them. And then this,
of course, they
single
got what they expected to get because of what they read. They read
Mhm,
about
exactly.
they read about different things like that, except that Gil was into more things, and with the photography, etc. So he brought his own interest into it as well.
Yeah, exactly. And what a good thing that they were still using glass negatives in those days to have those kinds of that kind of not ephemeral, not gonna get too much acid on it and disappear out of the photo album. That was really wonderful. It's an interesting story, and it's an interesting experience, and I think it has a lot to say about not only individuals who are interested in personal experiences and abilities, but also the importance of having a community with that one single understanding.
Right.
Yeah.
And I've taught little workshops on how to do a sitter group. That's one of the things that you all have to have this common purpose. Once you have dissension, forget it.
Yeah. It reminds me a lot too of bacheladors kind of ideas of things where you get everybody all riled up together and everybody's thinking about the same thing, and then the phenomena just kind of flows. And that's something very similar. Listen, anybody else have any questions, or if you want to turn on your video and make a comment? We are not locked up like we were yesterday, so it's totally okay to do that. Let's see. One of the things, let me look up a little bit farther up. Oh, Angel was saying it's interesting that ectoplasm is the white substance that mediums give you when they're in session and in trance, but not every medium can produce ectoplasm. And then we know from some of the old records that people that have managed to capture some, such as the Institute in Paris, years later, when you go back to the cabinets, there's nothing in the glass anymore. So it's an interesting.
It's a mysterious kind of thing that we haven't figured out yet, because as I said, some use it, or some it seems to manifest itself, and others no. So we don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
And yet they're still producing effects, whatever. So, I don't know.
The other thing that struck me was I didn't remember about the candlestick, and I found that really interesting because of the wedding ring on the Philip card table, that they could knock that table off to the side, and the thing never left the center of the table.
Philip's got the same. The Philip group got the same thing. They would put a candy for him. This is for Philip or something.
Oh.
Right. Well, they have candy, so they said, well, they put one for Philip. And if the table tilted, it didn't fall off. It stayed on the table.
It stayed there. Yeah. Well, the candlestick, that's interesting.
What's remarkable about the Philip group too is that they got everything in broad daylight. Nothing was.
Yeah.
And the film that Iris gave me a copy of it one time. They were on a television program with television lights. The table didn't really levitate, but it turned over, and then you could hear the raps, dull thuds. They put the mic next to the raps with bright television lights on them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was an interesting group too. And one of our speakers was talking about the Philip group. I know it was Christopher Larson and Susan Demeter in their conversation of their evolution from a couple of young ghost hunters to where they are now. They were talking about the impact, because they're both Canadians. They were talking about the impact of George and Iris's work and that whole Philip episode, and how we all heard about it, and what they had to say. So that's lovely. It ties back into some of the things that we've been talking about so far. And anybody else have any questions? Lizette was just saying this group think, and this belief that, yeah, this is supposed to work and it's going to work for us, and it's going to, whatever we need, it's going to happen. That it was sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. But I think Jerry Salfin will really, I'm going to mention this to Jerry Salfin because he's got a new theory about the importance of a community, of communal connection for these kinds of phenomena. And I think he would find this, I mean, I'm sure he knows about the case, but I think he would find that aspect of this conversation interesting.
It says 13 on chat. What does that mean?
Say again?
It says chat 13. What does that mean?
Oh, that means they're chat 13. I'm not quite sure. We got it.
It's like participants 11, chat 13. So I don't know. It means they did. I don't know.
Well, maybe we've got 13 messages in there over the course. We have 11 folks in the session, and we had a couple more at one point. Lisette is also singing your praises. She was saying that Rosemarie has been a real player in trying to figure all of this out. Not only the Bindelof case, but parapsychology owes you a lot for including the interviews with some of parapsychology's luminaries. Those books are so wonderful. The men and women in parapsychology and their reflections. And Carlton and I both devoured them.
And I'm grateful for you and Carlos for all the work you did helping me out.
Well, yeah, we didn't get there, but he didn't get there, but yeah, I still, that doesn't make me less happy about those books, because I thought they were really interesting biographies. And there was I still haven't found it recently, but J.B. Ryan and Louisa Ryan were in a psychological, like psychology through autobiography kind of a series. It wasn't the Murchison one. It was something later on, like in the 50s or the 60s. And they both they were kind of, conservative, but they were very interesting and insightful kind of discussions about their work and so on. And I always loved that book. I don't know what the heck happened to it, but I always loved that book because it gave you a variety of ways to make a contribution in the area that you're interested in. And I think men and women in parapsychology did that too, for not just for us, but for people younger than us. And, it's just, it's
That's
important.
What I do, especially with the second book.
Yeah.
More people from different areas of the field, et cetera. And
yeah.
All fascinating stories. And I'm
exactly.
People haven't read it.
Yeah, exactly. I'm those kinds of things. People think, oh, well, that's a reference book, so my library's going to pick it up. I don't have to buy it myself. And it's just horrible when that happens, because having those kinds of things as motivation on your own shelf is really an important thing, I think, and very, very interesting. It kind of guides you where you need to go. Well, one of these days, I have a idea in my head about my YouTube channel, and Lisette, you can steal this idea absolutely, of doing origin stories and getting people to come and talk to me about how they got interested in the field. Carlos did that to an extent in his blog. And I'd like to pull those 5 questions out and see what I can get on YouTube, because I think that would be really interesting. Lisette is saying, have you ever experienced table levitation yourself?
She's directing that to everybody.
Is she? To everybody? I'm asking you.
with a class, but we got the table to spin, but I don't know if that seemed to be more, tactile, whatever it is. I forget.
Yeah. Carlos and I were once at an SPR conference at Brighton, and we were staying late after the thing was over. So we were there for a day or 2 days with Alan Gauld and his wife Sheila, Tony Cornell, and a guy that he'd brought with him to do filming. And Andrew McKenzie, who was already, I think, 90 something. And it was Carlos and I and Kathy Dalton, and we were so excited to have this like delay that we were in the hotel. So Tony said, well, we got to go into the bar because it was a Sunday night and the manager only had us, there was nobody else. And he got this idea about, well, nobody's in the bar on Sunday night, so why don't you guys go in cafe tables, go in there and see if you can move them around. And Sheila and I parked ourselves at one in a corner and we're trying to make it move, just the two of us, when we looked over and saw the people around Tony's table actually running after it, trying to keep their hands on the thing. We were all so excited. And then, of course, later he showed us a little bit about how he was making this happen in a fraudulent way. So it was like, oh, thanks a lot. And Sheila and I just kept trying, but nothing ever happened for us. But it was really an exciting evening, I must say. Randy is saying group dynamics and PK experimentation do seem to be conducive to producing phenomena, possibly due to being able to avoid ownership inhibition, because it's a group rather than any one individual, right? So he says, I often wondered if hypnosis might be utilized with individuals to try and bypass that ownership inhibition. Plant a hypnotic suggestion that PK is possible. It's totally normal. And of course, you can do it too. That's an interesting idea.
I like the idea of hypnosis. And you look at,
yeah,
I think hypnosis is something that really we should be looking more into. And of course, trance is self-hypnosis. That's what trance is. So
yeah,
I think Garrett said that, right, Lizette? Garrett said that trance is self-hypnosis. Certainly we know that Edgar Cayce did self-hypnosis.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course, Sirius got the
worked himself up.
No, he got the idea because of hypnosis.
Oh, I see.
He was hypnotized, and I think what happened with him, he had to drink in order to get himself into that state.
Yeah,
that was the way he got into it. It wasn't so much self-hypnosis; it was through alcohol, which is, of course, not the best thing to do. But he didn't seem to be able to perform unless he was a couple of sheets to the wind.
Into an altered state that was quite pleasant to get there. I have a vague memory that when I first moved to Rogers Park in I've forgotten the name of it, Edgewood, the next neighborhood down from Rogers Park in the northern part of Chicago was where Sirius was living. And I think we overlapped for a couple of years. And I remember hearing stories from like Gordon Melton and John Bisaha and other people that were around at the time that knew more what was going on, that he would he'd be out and about and walking around and recognizing folks and chatting with them and that kind of thing. And I think I was told one time that I actually went by him when we were walking down to that particular area, but I don't remember it. And it was like, my God, if I had a brain, I'd been able to talk to Ted Sirius. But there were a number of people at the time, in the early 70s that were interested in parapsychology and active in parapsychology. So they knew about him. And Brenda Dunn was still in Chicago as well. So I think she might have known him too. I actually had lunch recently, or coffee recently with John Bisaha, who was my undergraduate professor and also Brenda Dunn's undergraduate professor. And he was talking a little bit at the end of the coffee about maybe being interested again, because he had done a lot of work with remote viewing, especially being kind of a conduit for Russ Targ and Hal Puthoff to get something into the literature, because the journals in parapsychology were not interested in letting these people that nobody knew come in with this new methodology. So he and Brenda did an experiment and got it published. And then after that, the doors were open to Targ and Puthoff, which they should have been from the beginning.
Lizette just put something up about her grandmother. Using furniture to move around the hospital room. I was trying to read it while you were speaking. Garrett, I concentrated more on the mental, but she did, for instance, Larry LeShan tried to get her to do some experiments with affecting film. And she was annoyed because she was busy doing something. So she did something, just said, yeah, okay, go look at it. And I think, I don't remember, it was like, he writes about it in the second Men and Women, but I think it was like every other sheet, there was something on the unexposed film that he had that she affected just by kind of waving her hand at it, dismissing him. So she obviously had the ability, but perhaps she just wasn't into that.
Well, Mackenzie, her mentor, insisted that she stick with one, is what Lisette is saying, and I was remembering that from one of the biographies, is that he felt that if she went the physical way or tried to do both, she wouldn't be proficient in
Right.
in both of them. One of them would
Exactly.
get lost. Yeah,
And
he
couldn't do it.
oh, and she said that Eric Dingwall was always wanting her to do physical. Yeah, we actually, I don't know if you were there, Lisette, and I've forgotten whether it was in Lloyd's talk. I mentioned that about Garrett having had physical mediumship at the beginning in the hospital room episode. So yeah. Any other questions, guys? Or comments? Hard to follow. It's hard to follow Randy. That was a great comment there.
I'd like to thank you, Rosemarie, for this great presentation you gave. I think there's some really good points here to take into account. As I mentioned in the beginning, your talk actually has quite a few implications, a few of which you touched upon in your talk in relation to poltergeist or RSPK type phenomena. One of them, I think, is that the fact that Gil Roller and his family, they had poltergeist phenomena occurring, before he became involved with Bindelof's group, and we see several other instances of that as well. We know of a few others, such as Matthew Manning and
yes, exactly.
and Dee Dee Hume, as you mentioned, and a few others. Let's see, there's Cleo Georgiou, who was the Tenagris's PK adept.
Okay.
And yeah, so there are a few instances that we know of that, which are really interesting. So it kind of makes us wonder, well, is there an aspect of PK that's unconscious, but maybe it comes out a little bit more better when you're kind of in sort of like a group situation, as Randy was pointing out with ownership inhibition. Maybe there's something about it.
It's also it's a physiological thing as well. I think certain people are built physiologically to be psychic or to be psychokinetic or whatever, or both. My ex-husband was both. He was very psychic and he was very psychokinetic, so it was also a louse. But anyway, we won't talk about that. But yeah, there was so many things. It's just so unexplored, and people are so frightened. If they do have an experience, they cut it off because they get scared. But good looking, as I remember, Cecil said,
I heard that more than once around the PF after you had a visit. He was Italian, right?
He was. He is.
Yes, he is. Oh, right, he is. Yeah. So, so there's your answer, Lisa. Those Mediterranean types, as we all know.
Actually, it wasn't my type. The attraction for me was his ability. And I was more of a mentor than anything. And he took advantage of it. Yeah, he saw me as someone he could use anyway. So,
well, glad he's out of your life and you're flourishing and have been flourishing for decades and decades.
I have no regrets in my life. It doesn't have regrets.
Yeah.
Learn. And I learned a lot from him. Living with somebody who's psychic, you learn a lot.
Right, exactly.
I had a lot of experiences myself. It's like I think Jewel called it a psychic contagion. I had some experiences before, but little precognitions, a lot of precognitive dreams, but it was more concentrated then because dealing with it all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fascinating.
Well, this has been a wonderful experience, and thank you again for listening and
Oh, not a problem. I am so glad I put the whole curriculum into Brian's hands, and some of the folks he invited I had never heard of before,
Brian
and
is
I have,
wonderful. He was patient with
yeah,
me.
oh my God, I have learned so much in this Paramook. It's just amazing, and and I think everybody has been wonderful, and there's been this very lovely kind of convergence of various aspects of all of this talks together, and that's really wonderful.
There's definitely been you mentioned here how some of these cases might also be sort of like not just a living agent type of thing, but also maybe multiple agents. We were finding cases like that. The case that Beth Hedwell was talking about in her last talk here, that Jerry and I were involved in, that seemed to be possibly be a multiple agent case because it involved a family rather than just one individual agent. And so there were kind of mixed hints about that. And so that kind of raises the question, are some of these cases, are they really kind of involve almost like what you see with sitter groups, people sort of like combining together their PK ability and kind of things like that?
Mary Rose Barrington was involved in some RSPK case that she said it was a combination of the mother and the daughter and whatever. It was a family kind of thing, sure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not only one person sometimes, or even the Fox sisters even. I think that was
Yep.
both two of the sisters at least in combination that created that.
Yeah, and then here you said that Larry and Gil both kind of maybe had that kind of situation too.
Larry couldn't do it on his own, I don't think, unless maybe he just didn't believe he could. See, which is another problem with this field. If you don't believe you can do something, you're not going to be able to do it. But definitely his energy was drawn upon, and he seemed to be the one who was having also fierce as Lizette. He seemed to be the one who was having, along with Gil, these experiences outside of the seance room with the disappearing teeth and the switched labels and the cracked crystal. So yeah, it could very well be. I've thought that myself. I mentioned it to him one time. We were chatting on the phone, and he was living in California, of course, and he poo-pooed the idea, but I think he probably did have. He certainly contributed energy from Randy back to everyone. I think Rogo was the first writer to latch onto the multiple agent. Yeah, and Scott Rogo was very careful about working with the family logically and helping them out. His goal, as he said, was to go. I remember him saying this. To help the family first, and then figure out what was causing it, etc.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there are these two cases that I can think of that with Rogo, where he suggested that there was possibly a family situation involved rather than just a kind of like a single agent situation. So that kind of raises the question: might that also account for other cases where sort of like we've been focused on looking at for a single agent, but there's actually maybe more than one? Could that maybe possibly account for cases where no agent has been readily identifiable and things like that? So that kind of touches upon another thing too, for you, Rosemarie, when I wanted to have you as one of our speakers, because sitter groups do have implications that I think are very important to consider here. So I want to thank you again for being willing to speak about the Bindelof sitter group.
Well, it's my pleasure. I was very fond of Gil and thought a lot of him, and it's a case that really should be known. It was so well documented, and there was just no way that anybody could have been cheating. I mean, for somebody like Monty to really change his life, to go into a field, it really changed his life. And I remember that's what he wanted me to write about. He said, I just want you to write about what we did and how it changed each of our lives, And I said, well, you have to write more than that. but anyway, it was certainly true.
Well, and he ended up contributing so many different things to the field in terms of his writing and just being around and participating and all of that. I mean, just very, very astute individual. So
it caused him to be open more to. For instance, he was the one who brought back the films of Kulagina. If you remember, he brought them to Maimonides. And
Right.
that's when Parisi saw the film and was
Yeah.
to do and tried to do the same thing and succeeded at it. So he was responsible for that. And he would
Yeah. And Kulagina was a Russian PK artist, and I can remember watching those videos probably in the parapsychology course I took at Mundelein with Bisaha. And it was so interesting. And then later on we had someone, I've forgotten his name now, Victor Eremenko maybe, who had come over to the Rhine Center back in the 80s and was showing us all of these different things and trying to see if he could, get any of us to become adepts. And basically no. But we really enjoyed hearing about her and seeing the movie again, and then trying all of these activities, with the compasses and everything like that. It was really interesting. So yeah, that's an important aspect of the field. We still tend not to be as interested in the physical stuff as we are in the mental stuff. And the physical stuff, I think, are well, and especially this combination, this talk we had yesterday from Beth Hedfa, talking about how you do handle a family that's going through a poltergeist experience in a variety of psychological and psychic, also and intuitive methods.
of course,
It's just very
mental phenomena are common.
yeah.
Phenomena are much rarer, and it's very hard to get. And then you have the tricksters who come in, and you've got to have somebody who's well versed in magic and a sleight of hand, etc., in order to determine whether this person is right. When we mentioned Kulagina, I was thinking also her first experiences were spontaneous. She would get angry and things would fall out of closets, etc.
Uh-huh.
So she was convinced that she was the cause of something. Mental is easy to follow, right. Physical.
Yeah.
It's difficult, yes. Yeah, it's very hard to to accept these things.
Yeah. But a lot of time it's the most complex and the most difficult to understand or investigate kind of phenomena that give us the biggest bang for the buck in terms of thinking about what this says about what we can do and how the world works and all that kind of stuff. So it's so important to stick with it and get it systemized.
Well, it's easy for someone if you see someone tells you something that's a telepathic communication. So you say, oh, well, they're guessing. But if you see a table levitating and there's no reason for it to levitate, you can't judge and say they're guessing. Something is going on there. Something is that our science hasn't figured out yet.
Yeah, so, definitely.
I think it's the more important road.
Yeah, I'm getting there, I must say. The other half of the family always knew that, but I'm still getting there. Definitely. Well, I just want to thank you again, and thank you for bringing this wonderful case to us, and we will put a link somewhere so that you can go out and buy that book, and take a look at the PF videos that are related to this. And there's a lot here that mixes up in what we were talking about this time. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a better time with your throat, although you did really, really well, I must say, and I still have my electricity, so we're both in the right place here. Yeah. No, you did well. I've got ginger tea, so a cup of hot tea will do you good, I'm sure. There you go. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, and thank you guys for coming. And let me put up the last bit of the thing and tell you what's coming up. Not that there's a whole bunch of stuff, but there's some. Okay, now let's get to the back end here. Okay, so tomorrow we have an unusual experience. There's going to be a Paramouc discussion at 2 p.m. Chicago time in the virtual world Second Life. I will be putting up a tutorial in a little while about how to go and get a free account in Second Life and get your avatar. Dean Radin and Dick Bierman both chose to be professors from Hogwarts when we had them in Second Life to give talks. And also some information about the library. We're going to meet at the Zaire Library and Learning Center in the Chilbo community in Second Life, and I'll give you that information as well in the video that I'll be putting up in the playlist in a couple of hours. So that's tomorrow. On March 28th, we'll have Anne Whisper from Parascience in Cheshire, United Kingdom. She will be talking about creating the dead, how do auditory perception, paranormal belief, and individual differences affect the interpretation of alleged electronic voice phenomena. And that will be at 9 a.m. Central, which is 10 a.m. Eastern and 8 a.m. Mountain, and I'm sorry to everybody in California, but we will be recording that one as well. Also going on next week, which is the last week of live sessions for the Paramouc, Brian will be giving a talk at 3 p.m. Central on March 30th called Seeking Spectral Insight. We will have a Paramouc closing session on the 31st at 3 p.m. Central. And on Saturday, the 1st of April, we will have an open discussion forum at 3 p.m. as well. And I just wanted to let you know that I am working on all of the videos that we need to get done. The next one that'll be up will be Pam Heath's talk. And I have a few more to go, and hopefully by Monday we'll be all done all the way through Dr. Hedva. So that should be a good thing. Thank you guys, and we hope to see you in some of the rest of the sessions. And if not, I hope you get into that Paramouc playlist. And Lizette's Paramouc playlist goes all the way back to 2015, and there's lots to see there. So thank you very much. And thank you, Rosemarie, again, and have a good afternoon.
Thank
Okay.
you, Brian. Bye-bye.
Bye now.